Anyone that's been following me for any amount of time knows that I tell each and every one of you to go out and study the scriptures for yourself. Don't be sheep. Don't follow your favorite pastor or your favorite TikToker or anybody blindly. I want you to be able to support your doctrine in a well-rounded way that makes sense in the totality of scripture. And I don't want you to follow me. I want you to follow Messiah Yeshua. I want you to follow the Bible. So with that being said, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that everything on my page is 100% accurate. Any revelation that you receive from anything I say on my page comes from the Most High alone. But I'm willing to admit that not everything I believe and teach may be right. And sometimes there's multiple interpretations of stuff that makes sense scripturally. And sometimes I like to cover both sides of it so you can look at things from a different angle and make up your own mind. Because I encourage you to look at things in scripture from every different angle possible. I want you to read lexicons and concordances and study different manuscripts and study the cultural context and the history of these places that are being spoken about in the Bible. Bottom line, I want you to study to show yourself approved before the Most High. Because on Judgment Day, it's not going to matter what I said or your favorite pastor said. It's going to matter what you did and said. Because we all get the choice to believe and follow people. And unfortunately, we're living in the times where most of those people are leading us down unbiblical paths. And teaching doctrines based on assumptions and opinions and not on scripture. Which again is why I encourage all of you to study for yourselves to show yourself approved and not to be a blind sheep following someone down the broad path that leads to destruction. Now, with all that in mind, I want to go over an interpretation of Ephesians 2 with you. Ephesians 2:15, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of two, so making peace. A couple of months back, I did a video on this very verse talking about what this all possibly means. Because we know that Messiah Yeshua didn't abolish the law of Moses. He literally couldn't. It's impossible biblically, and that would create so many holes in doctrine, I can't even begin to tell you. One interpretation I gave with this falls in line with Deuteronomy 4:2, where it says, you cannot add or take away from the commandments of God. But they are God's commandments. He can do with them what he wants, just we can't. And I brought up sacrifices as an example. This could have been talking about things like Yeshua abolishing the ordinances of sacrifices. Because we know that the Gentiles weren't able to make sacrifices like the Jews were. They didn't have temples, they didn't have priests. And we know that Messiah is the sacrifice once and for all. But we see things like the apostles still performing sacrifices all the way up to the time the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And then we can look at verses like this in Hosea 6. For in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak to your fathers or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. The law for sacrifices was added later. And obviously today, us being scattered throughout the world, we can't perform sacrifices like the Torah asks us to. That's just a law we can't follow the way God asked us to follow because the proper provisions aren't in place anymore. And obviously, our Father in heaven decided to destroy the temple, which is how we could do sacrifices in the first place. So in Ephesians 2, this could be a foreshadow of Christ abolishing these ordinances like sacrifices. That is one interpretation. I want to give you another one that might actually make more sense. But again, I leave it up to you to test the scriptures for yourself and draw biblical conclusions that make sense. So with that being said, let's dive into the concordance on this one. And this is why I love the Blue Letter Bible app. It has it built right in for you. Then we're going to scroll down to the ordinances that were abolished. And it's the Greek word dogma. And like many words in the Bible, it has a plethora of different biblical usages. And this is why context of the surrounding verses is so important, so that you can figure out which one of these is being used. We can see that it's public decrees, even laws from the Roman Senate, from rulers, and even in some instances, the law of Moses. I'm going to show you why this word that Paul stated is not the law of Moses, though. We're going to check the lexicon for just a little bit more information. This is Thayer's Greek lexicon, if you're curious, and it says in Ephesians 2:15, the law containing precepts in the form of decrees. That's not actually a whole lot of help. So let's go back and study the surrounding verses and see if we can pull out more context to help us figure out which context and biblical usage this word is being used in. But first, let's do a quick Google search. If we look up online what the biblical definition of dogma is, it says, in the Christian church, dogma means a belief communicated by divine revelation and defined by the church. So when Paul uses that word, it could very much mean that the interpretation of the law from the church or the rulers and leaders, i.e., man-made doctrine about what God's laws are. And that definition actually makes a lot of sense if we go back and read the surrounding verses. Let's do that. Starting from verse 11, therefore remember that at one time you, Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands. Remember that you were at one time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. So Paul is talking about the Gentiles here and how they were separated from God and his covenants. But now, in Messiah Yeshua, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace. If you study the Jewish culture at this time and actually deeply study the Torah and the Gospels, you see that all these walls were created by the Jews. More specifically, by the Talmudic man-made oral laws. They had so many laws separating the Jewish people from anybody else. In fact, it was so bad that the Jewish people didn't see other cultures as even humans. They saw them as lower than them, like animals. And if you read things like what happens in Acts 10 and 11 with Peter, that is what that is talking about. So it makes sense that these ordinances that Yeshua destroyed were not the laws that God gave in the Torah, but the man-made laws that separated the Gentiles from the Jews. The man-made church dogma that said these people are less than you. They're not worthy to have the Torah. They're not worthy to be in covenant with the Most High. Because in the first century, this was Jewish thought. This is what they believed, and this is what oral law taught. But if you study the Torah, there is no such thing like that. In fact, in the Torah, it's the exact opposite. Exodus 12, there shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Numbers 15, for the assembly there shall be one statute for you, and for the stranger who sojourns with you, a statute forever throughout your generations. You and the sojourner shall be alike before the Lord. One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you. The Torah never built walls of separation between the Jews and the Gentiles. Man-made doctrine and dogma did. And it makes far more sense that that is what Jesus came to destroy. Because he tells us literally over and over and over again to obey the laws found in the Torah. And our Messiah constantly said stuff like this, but it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. And he constantly says stuff like this in Matthew 7, that he will turn away believers because they are lawless. He says, I never knew you because you are workers of lawlessness. You didn't hear me. You didn't listen to my voice. Luke 6, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? The path that Jesus laid out for us is following the Torah how he did it. Everything in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount can be found in the Torah. In John 15, our Messiah said this, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. All of his commandments are found in the Torah. So in Ephesians 2, it makes sense that this is not the Torah he's speaking about.